You know, the Republican response has been swift. They've got their own narrative about what all this is all about and what's going on. And I find it fascinating. What the Republicans are saying is this was an open primary. Now, let me explain how this works. And I'm an opponent of open primaries, just for the record. And it has to do with an experience I had growing up in Michigan. Open primaries are where anybody can vote for any candidate of any party. A closed primary is where if you are registered as a Republican, you can vote in the Republican primary. If you're registered as a Democrat, you can vote in the Democratic primary. If you're registered as a Libertarian or a Green, you can vote in the Libertarian or Green primary, but you can't vote in anybody else's primary. And I think that's the way it should be. Because being a member of a party is being like a member of a club, and an election is where you decide who's going to represent your club. And I don't think Democrats should be deciding who's representing the Republican club, and I don't think Republicans should be deciding who's going to represent the Democratic club. And the example that I've used, I've told you this story many times over the years, is when I was a teenager, when I was 17 years old, in Michigan. There was the Democratic Party wanted to send Hubert Humphrey as their nominee and Humphrey ultimately was the nominee, the party's nominee in the election of 68. They wanted to send Hubert Humphrey to the Democratic National Convention. But the Republicans in Michigan organized a campaign that they were completely open about. It got reported in the newspapers. In fact, it's one of the ways that the Republicans talk to each other about it. Organized a campaign to vote in Michigan's open primary for George Wallace. George, segregation then, segregation now, segregation forever Wallace. And because the Republicans voted in such large numbers, the Democratic primary numbers were substantially inflated. They were tens of thousands of more people voted in the Democratic primary than is normal in a primary. And they were obviously Republican voters, and Michigan was embarrassed to be the only state in the entire United States that sent George Wallace as their nominee to the Democratic Party. Horrifying and humiliating thing for Michigan. Now, in the case of the Canada race, there were actually 13,000 or 14,000 fewer people who voted in this primary than voted 2 years ago in the primary. So it's pretty unlikely that any Democrats or any consequential number, keep in mind, Canada lost this by 10 points. It's pretty unlikely that any consequential number of Democrats voted in the race, because if they had, they would have at least brought the Republican race participation, the Republican primary participation, up to where it was 2 years ago or 2 years before that. And this is one of the lowest turnouts for a Republican primary that we've seen in a long, long time. And I think it's because the establishment Republicans figured, hey, Cantor's got this thing in the bag. Why should we show up? He spent $5 million. His opponent spent $200,000. So I'm not even going to bother going to the polls because I know everybody else is. And the people who were gung-ho for Dave Bratt were the ones who had been listening to Laura Ingraham and Mark Levin, not realizing that they're being funded by the Koch brothers, who's the head of the Koch, the Charles Koch Foundation, the Cato Institute, had given $500,000 to Dave Bratt and his university to have him teach Ayn Rand economics. And those people listening to the right-wing talk radio showed up in large numbers.